got.
Okay, so Rise and Decline of the Third Reich. This is the 4th edition map. We're looking at the Eastern Theater. There's going to be two factions, as you can imagine, Axis and Allies. And there are 6 major powers that are going to be involved in the war: Germany, Italy, Russia, France, England, and the United States. That geographically is represented off map. And not all of those nations will begin at war with one another, but it's almost certain by mid to late game that they all will be, and they will all join their historical factions. The goal of the game, as either faction, is essentially to conquer each of the enemy powers, or as many enemy powers as possible. And you do that by capturing the capital, Paris, and holding it through their combat turn. One turn in this game is one season, that's tracked down here, and the game will run from 1939 fall through 1945 summer. Right, so you conquer an enemy major power by moving your ground units into the capital and holding it through the enemy combat phase. The Axis powers have to conquer 2 of the 3 conquerable Allied powers. The United States cannot be conquered. They conquer 2 for a tactical victory. They conquer 3 for a decisive victory. But the game
Can you
goes up.
tell me what it means to have a decisive versus a tactical victory? Are there gradients of failure as well?
Yeah, it's just bragging rights is the only difference it makes, and the gradients of failure would be the other side winning a victory. So it's not like both factions could win or both factions could lose or something. So if Germany conquers Paris and London, that's a tactical victory for the Axis, but they also have to hold those territories through the end of the game. Um, so the Allied victory condition is to conquer both Rome and Berlin. One alone won't do, and the sooner they conquer those, the greater the victory they'll achieve. So that's the gradient of defeat for the Axis. So if you conquer at the historical date in summer 45, um, or rather just before the historical date in summer 45, then you will win a marginal victory. Otherwise, it's a stalemate. Right, so the objectives, the Axis have to conquer enemy factions and then hold them through the end of the game, through 45. The Allies have to conquer Germany and Italy, and the sooner they do it, the bigger the victory is. Right, so that's major powers. Their capital has this star here. There's also minor powers. The black borders are country borders, and these minor powers also have a capital. To conquer them, you also just have to move into their capital, but minor powers, nobody gets a turn to help them out and recapture the capital. Once you capture the capital, they're out of the game permanently and you've conquered them. Luxembourg, even though it doesn't have a capital mark, is treated as if it had a capital for the purpose of being conquered. There's also regions that are treated not as powers, but as colonies. So those are Eastern Europe, um, the Middle East, and all Egyptian countries. So to capture a colony, you have to occupy all of their cities. So to capture Palestine, you have to have both Haifa and Jerusalem. Haifa has a open circle here that indicates that this is a port city and it can base naval units. If we go up to Athens, we can see it has both a star and a circle. That's a capital and a port. Right, so the colonies, you have to hold all of their cities, and then you retain control of it until someone else takes away all of their cities from you. So we talked about cities. That's these dots or circles with the names near them. So some other map features are terrain, like mountains or marshes. Unlike some other war games, terrain will never slow ground units down just because of the scale that we're looking at. It always costs 1 movement factor to move 1 hex, regardless of the terrain. So what terrain will do is to give the defender a bonus. So the terrain we're looking at is open terrain, no effect on the defender. There's mountains. Um, these triple the defender's bonus. We'll cover it again later in combat. Marshes also triple defense. And this symbol here is a fort. This means the entire hex. You see these little gribbly markers. That means the entire hex is a fort, regardless of where these markers are drawn on the map. It's a fort no matter where you attack it from. Like if you look at, I guess that's a bad example. If you look at Maginot, it looks like these are facing northeast in Metz, but even if you attack Metz from the west, it'd still be a fortress. Fortress is quadruple defense. This dotted area near the coast is a beach. This means that that location is a valid target for an amphibious invasion. We'll talk more about invasions, um, but you can invade any of these beaches, and you can also invade islands. One hex islands can be invaded. Larger, like Scapa Flow, Copenhagen. Larger islands like Sardinia here can only be invaded from their beach hexes. These blue lines are rivers. Rivers will increase your defense if you're being attacked from across a river. And the last major feature on the map is these red lines that divide the entire map into three different theaters: the Eastern Theater, the Western Theater, and the Mediterranean Theater. And the importance there is that as a faction, you might engage in significantly different operations in each theater in any given season. Right, so to move in and conquer the enemy's capital, you're going to be using your ground units to occupy. So these are our ground units. What you're looking at is each token represents a corps-sized formation, about 50,000 men. And the color is the nationality. Sometimes there's a little name printed on the right-hand side here. That's just for funsies, doesn't mean anything. The symbol is the unit's type, and the numbers below are its combat factors and movement factors. So combat factor is just how hard it fights in ground combat or defends itself. It's always the same number on attack or defense, although on defense you might get a separate bonus. And movement factors are how many hexes this unit can move. Again, units are not slowed down by terrain. The only thing they're slowed down by is the presence of enemy armor. You can see when you look at these infantry units that sometimes there are different strengths for different units, even of the same nationality. So our types of ground units are, first of all, infantry with the crossbands here, our basic ground unit type. Paratroopers are airborne with the crossbands and a tiny parachute symbol at the bottom. Are elite, they cost 3 times as much, and they have a couple special abilities. Number one, they're going to ignore stacking limits. So normally you can only have 2 ground units in a given hex. I couldn't jam another armor in this hex, for example. But airborne are considered to be division-sized formations, so they can stack with other units, and they never count towards stacking limits. They can also, of course, paradrop. To paradrop, they have to be located on an airport. Every city is considered to have an airport, and also every nation will get a number of these airbase counters that they can place one airbase counter on X, and it adds an airport there. So they have to start their turn on an airport, and they have to be not near enemy armor. And if both those conditions are met, then they can jump up to 6 hexes away. So, for example, an airborne here in Rosyth could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and land all the way in Norway. So it's quite some distance, and gives you a lot of flexibility. Just mind, airborne can be eliminated if they get isolated and destroyed during their jump. Partisans can only be built late in the war, but they give you a lot of flexibility when you're dealing with a conquered nation. You can, as the Allies, build these in certain nations that the Axis have conquered, and they can like cut supply lines, take a valuable hex when the enemy isn't guarding it. Then our last unit is armor. So armor generally has higher combat strength and movement speed, but even more importantly, they have a couple of special rules. So those are, first, that they exert a zone of control. So if I take this armor, put it in England, put some German units down here. This armor is going to project a zone of control into the land portion of every hex adjacent to it. So all 6 of these hexes will be in this unit's zone of control, and it has a few effects. First of all, it's going to slow down enemy movement, as I had mentioned before. So if you are in an enemy zone of control, moving costs 2 extra movement factors. So this German infantry, if it moved away from this armor, it would pay 1 to move a hex, 2 extra because it started in zone of control of the armor. Common point of confusion, that's paid when you start in a hex that's in zone of control, not when you move into it. So moving into zone of control of this armor only costs 1. But then this infantry wouldn't be able to move again to either of these hexes, because it only has 2 factors left, and either movement would cost it 3 points. Zone of control also cuts enemy supply lines. I'll talk
and that applies. Sorry.
Good. No, good.
And does zone of control influence all ground units the same?
Yep.
Tanks and
all
infantry.
The same armor are affected by other enemy armor's zone of control. Yes. Right, zone of control also cuts enemy supply lines, and we'll talk about that, but basically supply can't pass through enemy zone of control. And last, it doesn't come up too much, but it is good to know. Zone of control will also stop paratroopers from making a jump. So if this armor was located here in Birmingham, this airborne located in Manchester would not be able to make a jump because it's in the armor zone of control. Zone of control does not extend across water. This marker is called a crossing arrow, and you can move ground units across it, you can attack across it, and it's treated like a river crossing. But armor's zone of control doesn't cross crossing arrows, so this paratrooper would be able to jump. Zone of control does cross rivers, just not actual bodies of water. So that's zone of control for armor, and the second important factor for them is what's called breakthrough and exploitation. So how this works is that if you make an attack that involves at least 1 armored unit, and you win the combat, so let's say these 2 units attack this German infantry unit, they eliminate him, our combat involved 1 armor, and then the next condition is we have to move at least 1 unit into that hex. So if we've done those 2 things, we attacked with armor and we won and we moved someone in, then this hex becomes what's called a breakthrough hex. And so I'm just going to grab a counter for that. So now any armor that has not yet conducted an attack, which was also adjacent to or stacked with any unit that participated in the combat, can move into the breakthrough hex. This movement ignores movement factors. It doesn't matter if the unit has already moved. As long as it hasn't attacked and it was adjacent, it can move into the breakthrough hex. And this also ignores stacking limits. So normally we could only have 2 units here, but if we decided from the original attack we wanted to move this armor in, this unit that's now referred to as an exploiting unit, and indeed any number of armor units, absolutely any number that were adjacent could move in and overstack here. So it lets you concentrate your armor, and then even more importantly, it allows you to perform exploitation movement. So after all normal combat has happened, then any units that participated in the breakthrough and became exploiting units can do exploitation movement. So I'll flip this over to show that they're doing exploitation. So all of these units can now move and attack again. Their movement has some limitations though. They basically have to form a chain of units that are separated by no more than a hex from one another. So what it comes down to is that this first armor could move up to 2 hexes. And then the next armor could follow that same route and then move up to 2 hexes further. So it's forming this chain here. Maybe this armor wants to come down 2 spaces and move here. And you can see the movement factors work out. They go 1, 2. They're now in zone of control of this armor, and so it costs them 3 to move here. So they spent their full 5. This one couldn't move another hex here. Then all of these units could go ahead and make attacks. So let's say they attack this German armor in Plymouth. There is a That's fine, they can eliminate it, but there is a limitation to their ability to advance into the hex. Normally, when you win a combat, anybody that attacked can move into the target hex. But when you're exploiting, you can't break this chain. So this armor could move in here, it's fine, it's still a chain of units, but this one couldn't move in because he'd break the chain to this guy. The other effect of performing exploitation is that your units are in exploitation supply the turn after they exploit, which just means that they don't have to have a normal supply line. They've brought supplies with them for just one turn. So basically armor units have a huge movement, really strong attack. They can create these breakthroughs that allow them to move even further. The fastest armor units in the game, German and American armor, with the right exploitation and breakthrough, can move up to 15 hexes in a turn. Right, so just to recap, ground units, its combat factor, movement factor. Our different types are infantry, airborne, partisans, and armor. Armor have the special ability to exert zone of control and to perform breakthrough and exploitation, and paras have the special ability to paradrop. So the only other units in the game are air factors and naval factors. It's going to help if you think of them as like strategic assets and not units, because you can see they're generic. There's not different types of air or different types of naval. It's just overall strength in the area. So air factors first are going to come in, you're going to buy them in stacks of 5, but due to casualties, or if you just choose to move them to different places and break them down, you can break them down into smaller strength groups. And they have to have a base. That base has to be an airport. So again, all cities and airbase counters are an airport, and each one can host 5 factors of air. They will get to move, just like, well, similar to ground units, and they move at the same time as them. And they move by moving up to 8 spaces from a friendly base to another friendly base. And you have to observe stacking limits by the end of the turn. So up to 8 spaces is their movement, and then they have up to an 8 hex range where they can operate. So 1, 2, 3, 4 could hit this place in Munich, or 2, 3, 4. This air factor could operate in Paris. They don't make attacks in the same way as ground units. Basically, there's a variety of missions they can run that result a little bit differently, but basically they can attack enemy air, they can attack enemy naval factors, or they can assist ground units. So the way that breaks out is their offensive missions are that they can attempt to counter-air enemy air factors. Maybe this is more realistic. We'll put the Germans in Bonn and the British in Paris. So in a counter-air mission, you designate air units that could potentially be coming from multiple bases. This type of mission is just fine. You designate them to attack an enemy air unit that's kind of on the ground in their base here. And air combat will result. Very probably, you will incapacitate this air. We flip it over to show that it's either incapacitated or has run a mission, and it will be unable to assist ground units. So that's counter-air. You can also offensively perform ground support. So if I have ground units attacking enemy ground units, I can designate one of my groups to assist in that ground combat, and then I just add the combat factors of the air to the ground combat. The markers on air units are always, it's their air factors first, and then their movement factors, or their range, which is the same for all air units. It's always 4. So this 2 air factors would add 2 to this unit's 3 when it's attacking. You can also bomb enemy ships. So sometimes you're going to bomb them in port. This is an offensive mission, again range 4. You might lose some planes. We might take out some Navy. Navy and planes cost the same. The thing is, Navy are, for reasons we'll get into, much harder to rebuild, so it's a good exchange. So those are our offensive missions: counter-air, ground support, or naval bombings. Any of these missions will flip the unit, invert them, and it makes them unable to defend themselves, to counter-air, and more importantly, usually it makes them unable to run any other missions. You can only run one mission, offensive or defensive, in a given season. So there are defensive missions that they can run. First of all, you can intercept enemy ground support. Actually, let's
So when you say defensive mission, that means if I don't spend them actively on my turn, or if I'm going second, that if I spend them during your turn, they're not available on my turn.
Yeah. An offensive mission is just one that usually occurs during your turn, and a defensive mission is one that usually occurs during the opponent's turn. But between my turn and yours, my air will only get to run one mission. It's not both a offensive mission and a defensive mission, just one. Right, so defensive missions, first of all, I can do defensive ground support. So I declare this before I know if I'm getting attacked, but if I have a critical hex I need to defend, I might designate some air to overfly them and contribute their air factors as combat factors. So I'll add this 2 to this unit's 3 when I defend. There's another offensive mission, though, where you can intercept an enemy's defensive mission. So if I'm the Germans and I want to attack these guys, I could send these 5 planes to intercept these 2 defensive air, and some air combat will result. If I win, then they'll be sent home, and they won't get to defend this ground unit. Another defensive mission we can run is to intercept enemy naval missions. So if I have the British air here, and I have the German Navy about to amphibiously invade England, I could send these air units to intercept them at sea and bomb them. It operates pretty similar to attacking a port. It just results in fewer casualties for both the Navy and the air. So those are the defensive missions: defensive air support and interception. Now, when air combat happens, whether it's because of counter-air or because of a defensive air interception like this, what happens is that both sides will roll a d6, and they will add to that roll their air factors that they're bringing. So England has 2 factors, they roll a 5, they have a total of 7. If you mouse over the units and hold, you'll also see this first bullet point is a DRM. It's a dice roll modification based on nationality. So the British and the Germans are better at flying than the French. If we mouse over the French, we see they have -1 DRM. So that also applies. So we have 2 plus 5 plus 0 is 7. The Germans have 5 plus 2. Their DRM is also 0. So they have a total of 7. If the British had 1, we'll flip this to a 6 for a minute. They win by 1 point, so the Germans would lose 1 air factor. The winner also could suffer casualties. They suffer half the casualties that they inflicted on the enemy, rounded down. So if the British win by 1, they would suffer nothing. But if they won by 2, they would lose 1. If we have a tie, though, then we just roll another die, and both sides lose that many factors. So in this case, the British would lose all they have, which is 2. You can never lose more than the opponent in this situation, so the Germans would lose 2. Right, so I think that's everything for air. We flip these guys to show they run a mission. I guess the only other point is that when you run counter-air, here's why you would do this strategically. So if it's the British turn, and I've got some other units around and I want to make an offensive, I don't want these German air to interfere and run defensive missions. So before I do any of that, I'm going to declare a counter-air mission, my 5 on their 5, and if I win on the dice, then this German air is going to be flipped and inverted. It won't be able to run a mission. I will also be flipped no matter what, because I ran a mission. But also, even if I lose, if I brought at least as many planes as they did, they have to flip. So oftentimes you'll run counter-air not with the intent to like totally destroy the enemy air force, but just to interfere with them and prevent them assisting their units. Okay, so I think that's it for air. And our last unit type is naval. So there's going to be some similarities with air. The naval magic number is 9. That's as big as a single token of a navy can get, although they might take casualties and drop in strength. Unlike air, you cannot voluntarily split up a 9-factor navy. In fact, you can never split up any token of navy, although you can recombine them. If I have a 1 and an 8, I can combine it into the 9. So like air, they also have to have a base. They have to be located in a port. Each port can host up to 36 naval factors, so that's up to 4 or 9 fleets. The number is just their naval factor. It's essentially their combat strength. Some hexes, like Portsmouth, Southampton, have 2 ports, so they can host 72 total factors. In these cases, I have to say when I bring a fleet in which port they're going to because it matters. Also, front boundaries are very relevant for front boundaries are very relevant for naval factors because a ship can only operate in its front. So these ships could intercept enemy German ships anywhere in the North Sea or the Atlantic, but not in the Mediterranean. Like aircraft, they have a variety of missions they can run, and they can only run 1 mission a turn, either offensive or defensive. So the missions are, they can, basically what they're going to do is to transport ground units, to intercept enemy navy, or to provide supply, or to provide shore bombardment. And it's actually easiest to explain the interceptions first. So let's just move some of these guys out of the way. Let's say, again, the Germans are trying to do an amphibious invasion. This 9 fleet is taking this 1 unit, and they're going to go try to invade Scapa Flow. So I, as the British player, can ask the German to draw the route that they intend to take. The Navy, by the way, it stays in its fleet. It does its fleet's base. It doesn't like hang out in the middle of the ocean. It stays where it's based. But I can ask the opponent to draw the line that they're going to take, and I say, very good. I'm going to intercept you. I have to draw out the line where I'm going to intercept, and we'll roll some dice. Basically, I want to be closer to the enemy. The further away they are at the point of interception, the harder it's going to be for me to actually locate them. Assuming I do locate them, some naval combat is going to result. This type of interception is, by the way, the only way that naval combat can result. You can't just go fight someone that's in port just because you feel like it. They have to come out. So I won't explain the details, but what you're going to do basically is compare the ratio of fleets. You obviously want to have more. That'll give you a bonus on a die roll. There will also be a national DRM. Again, the British have +1, the Germans have +2. Both sides will roll the dice. I'll just tell you that for 2 to 1, the British will have +3 on their dice. We roll the dice, and the winner will inflict some casualties on the enemy. The enemy inflicts half that many casualties on the winner. You'll take more casualties if you have a very large fleet, and if you were intercepted and you lost, you have to go home and your mission is canceled. So in this case, the British would inflict some casualties and then return to Portsmouth. They'd be flipped. The German would be flipped because he was successfully intercepted, and his mission wouldn't complete. He would not invade Scapa Flow. Interceptions can themselves be intercepted. So the Germans have these 2 fleets here, and this is in fact a really good way to guarantee that your amphibious invasion is going to work. They could intercept the British before they intercept the Germans, and maybe send their interception mission home back to Portsmouth before it could reach the Germans. The way it works is German declares the mission, British declare the intercept, Germans declare their counter-intercept, and then we roll to try and make it happen. So that's naval interceptions. So the other missions that run are to provide supply. I'll talk about it in more detail when we get to supply, but during your turn, if you need to supply troops that are overseas, you'll flip one or more fleets to escort that supply to them. Supply missions can never be intercepted. The last thing they can do is to move units. Unfortunately, this gets a little bit complicated. There's 3 ways you can move units. So during the movement phase of your turn, your ground units, like we were talking about, spend their movement factors to move hexes, one factor per hex. They can be transported over sea by fleets. This counts as a mission for the fleet. The fleet can carry a number of ground units equal to half its naval factors rounded down, so this combined fleet of 18 could carry 9 total. They could pick up units from multiple different ports, right? So they could have those 2 guys, and they could run a mission that has them pick up these guys in Portsmouth. We wouldn't actually move the tokens, but we just say that they move from Portsmouth, pick up at Harwich, and drop off units in Calais. If there's enemy armor near your port of embarkation, they will impose a +2 movement factor due to their zone of control on your cost of being picked up. There's no cost of being picked up, normally costs 0, costs 2 if there's armor nearby, and it costs 1 to disembark. Units could even walk to the port where they're going to be picked up. If the naval mission is defeated, the units return to their original port if they're able to, due to stacking limits. Right, so you could pick up from many places. You'd have to drop in 1 port only. The units could continue their movement after that. They could even attack. Air units can even be transported in this way, although they usually don't need to because they can move 8 on their own. So that's called sea transport, and it happens during normal movement phase. You could also amphibiously invade. This is like a D-Day invasion. You're going to be targeting a island or a beach hex. It happens during combat phase. There's some special requirements to this. The units that you're going to transport for an amphibious invasion have to start in the port where they're going to be embarked. The naval units could rebase to the port in order to provide the invasion transport. So you're going to designate 1 enemy beach to hit, so we're going to invade Calais. Because of all the supplies we need to bring in an invasion, our capacity for transporting units is much less. We can only transport 1/3 of our naval factors rounded down. So this fleet of 18, 1/3 rounded down would be 6, so we actually can't transport both armor. The Navy would just escort this armor in, some ground combat result. Amphibious invasions, the defender always is tripled on defense. We'll talk about that, what that means, but right, some combat will result if the ground forces take losses. By the way, the Navy can take those on the nose for them. It's very expensive to do, but if you absolutely need to get boots on the ground, you can do it. That'll be this naval unit's mission for the turn. Also, if there's leftover transport capacity on these ships, they can provide shore bombardment. This just increases the combat factors on the attack. So 3 naval factors will add 1 combat factor. Also, you could designate a whole separate fleet to provide shore bombardment. This fleet up in Rosyth could be designated not to transport troops, but just to bombard. You can't shore bombard any coastal hex normally, but you can shore bombard during an invasion. You can shore bombard against a land attack on an island, or against a coastal fortress like Leningrad. So German ships could sail all the way to Leningrad, provide shore bombardment for troops that were coming across from Finland, for example. And the last way that ships transport units is called strategic redeployment. Basically, they're going to assist relocating units across fronts. The ships themselves only move when they are rebased. They can rebase during strategic redeployment, and they can also rebase at the beginning of their turn, just by sailing from 1 port on their front to another friendly port on their front. That movement is interceptable, but strategic redeployment is never interceptable. And we'll talk more about strategic redeployment later. Right, so that's naval units. Again, just like planes, they have to be in a base. They can only run one mission in a turn. Those missions are to intercept enemy naval missions, which can even be an intercept mission, to see transport units during movement, to amphibiously invade during combat, to escort a unit during strategic redeployment, or to provide supply or shore bombardment. Right, so that's all of the unit types. I'll just demonstrate how all of this works together. So let's set up a quick scenario here where we've got German ground units in the north of France, maybe some air defending them in Paris, some British air located in London. Let's get us a big naval fleet here. We'll have some British ground units in France and some ground units in England. I'll also take another British Air Force here. And let's get some Germans in Antwerp. Just move all this other stuff out of the way before the confusion. Let's grab paratroopers just so we can demonstrate some of their value. Okay. So first off, like I mentioned, there are these three different theaters in the war. In each turn, there are three different options you can take for each theater. You can either pass, take an attrition option, or take an offensive option. The offensive option is going to be expensive. You only have so many resources each turn. But it's what enables you to do things like paradrop, do an amphibious invasion, or exploit with armor. So the rest of the movement that we talked about can usually be done regardless of the option you select. Just be aware this fancy movement is going to cost you extra. So let's say we took an offensive in the west, we paid for that, so now all of our units can perform these offensive abilities. And the British turn, they're going to try to take on the Germans here. Let's actually get them a little bit more air base than have. Great run. Okay, so as Britain, I just want to make as much headway into Netherlands and Paris as I can here. So the first thing I do is to relocate any Navy. The Navy are actually right where I want them. They're going to provide transport to this armor. And then next, I'm going to designate counter-air missions. So I'll fly from Harwich 1, 2, 3, 4. I could also relocate air at this point. So let's say I relocate these guys from Rosyth up to Great Yarmouth because I want them nearby for the offensive. So 1, 2, 3, 4 to get to Paris. Our convention, we draw a strike through the line if the entire air group is going to fly. And I don't have to designate any other air missions until I resolve counter-air, because it might flip these guys or it might not if I was using fewer air force than them. I know it's going to flip because I'm using at least as many as they have. So now me and the opponent are going to roll dice for the air combat. Germans roll a 1, Allies roll a 2. Our DRMs are both +0, so I rolled 5 + 2 is 7. You rolled 5 + 1 is 6. I win by 1. And both flip, and I'll trade out this German 5 air factor for 4. They've taken 1 damage. Germans. Alright, so I have 4 factors left there, but they can't defend these other Germans. Alright, so I'm going to go now into declaring the rest of my air missions. And this is all a scripted order that you have to obey every turn. Move naval units, then move air units, conduct counter-air,
That's
actually,
when you do an offensive?
Yep, yep, yep. There's a list at the back of the book of the order that these things happen in. So I did my counter air. Now I'm going to move ground units. These armor are where I want them. They started in a port. I'm not going to move them because I want them to do an invasion. The airborne is where I want them. They're on an airport. I want them to jump this turn. These guys here, I'm going to move them up a little bit. I'll move the armor 2 spaces to Brussels because this is a minor country. This means that Germany is immediately going to lose control of the Netherlands, so great. That'll cost them some resources. And I will move this infantry up with them as well. Actually, I'll move them here so we see how this combines with an amphibious invasion. Alright, so now I'm going to declare the rest of my air missions. This 5 stack of air, I can designate them for a variety of different combats. So I'm going to send 2 factors to a ground combat that I will resolve later there. And I will send 2 into here. Actually, I'll send all 3 into Calais, promising that I will later do a ground combat. Now I've moved all my ground units. I go on to the combat phase. During the combat phase, I announce an amphibious invasion from Portsmouth to Calais. So the German player with fleets in Antwerp, he's going to have to go into 1 to 3 odds, but he's desperate, so he's going to announce an interception here from Antwerp to Calais. He's 1 space away, so he needs anything but a 6 on a single d6 to intercept. There's a chart for that. Unlucky for him, he misses the intercept. If you miss an intercept, your fleet is not flipped. It can still perform a mission later. So all of these fleets are flipped. They're win or lose. They've transported these units. So now we're going to go on to this amphibious invasion. I've transported both of these British armor. That costs 24 points of Navy to do that. So there's 3 points of Navy left in this stack of 27 that can provide shore bombardment. I'm also going to have these airborne drop in this phase onto the beach. If you drop onto enemy units, you have to attack those units, by the way. So my total combat strength is 3 from airborne, 4 from armor, 1 left over from my Navy, and 3 from this. So that should be what, 11, 3, 4, 1, 3, 11. I'll also have this ground unit help attack the beach. Even though I'm kind of flanking these guys from behind, I don't stop them being tripled on defense. So tripled means their combat factor of 1 will be tripled to 3. There's a chart down at the bottom of the board here that lists different odds for combat and what the results are. Right. So what we do is we determine the ratio, the odds between my combat factors and theirs. I had a total of 11. They had 3. So that'll give us 3 point something. We always round down. I have 3 times their combat factors, 3 to 1. So what we do is we look at this table for the 3 to 1 row, and we roll a die. Okay, I got 5. I'll go down until I get to the 5 row. That gives me a D result. D means the defender is entirely eliminated. In all ground combats, one side will be entirely eliminated. The other side might take some casualties. The other results we could get, A means the attacker is eliminated. X means exchange. So if I rolled an exchange, the side with the fewest factors is eliminated. The other side has to remove that many factors. So I'd rolled exchange. This infantry would be removed because the Germans have fewer total factors, but I have to lose 3 factors. It's 3 because he's 1 times 3 for being amphibiously invaded on the beach. So I could lose this infantry, say. The other results are counterattacks. Counterattack 1 means you roll on the 1-to-1 table, 2 means roll on the 2-to-1 table, and so on. Or actually, counterattack 2 is roll on the 1-to-2 table, counterattack 3 is roll on the 1-to-3. Counterattack with no number after it means you recalculate the odds. All of the defenders attack all of the attackers. So we could have an exchange back and forth. In the scripted mod, there are buttons down here that just automatically do that for you. So we could roll 2 to 1, it prints the result down here. Okay, but anyway, what actually happened is we rolled a D, that means defenders eliminated. I do have to move in any units that participated in the Amphibious Invasion. And by the way, no matter how many units I carry, only 2 units can participate in the attack itself. Now, I didn't count this armor when we calculated ground factors, right? That's because you can break through on an Amphibious Invasion. And I had this armor unit that was on board the boats. They can become an exploitation unit. So I'm going to declare this a breakthrough hex, and this British armor is going to participate in exploitation. But we don't do exploitation until later in the round. I'm going to have to do the rest of all my ground combats. So each unit can only participate in 1 combat. By the way, this infantry has already fought here, so we can't fight either of these other 2 hexes. But I can have this armor attack Antwerp. I've got 4 armor, 2 in the air. That gives me 6 factors. The opponent has 1 factor. It's doubled on an open hex to 2, so that's 3 to 1 odds. So I just go down and push the button. The result is defender eliminated. I have the option to move in a hex. I will. The German Navy has to relocate. They'll go to Wilhelmshaven, let's say. When a Navy is forced to relocate, like this, by the way, it can be intercepted if there's any fleets available to do so. These fleets can't because they ran a mission. And then after all my ground combat has been resolved, I can do Exportation Movement. I'll have this armor move up 2 hexes, advance closer to Berlin. If there are any Germans here, they could do another combat and potentially advance even further. So that's how all of these different pieces fit together. To play the game proper, the last parts we need are to talk about supply, the attrition option, and resources, what's called BRP, basic resource points. Some of these I'll cover in brief. So I mentioned that you have to pick between pass, attrition, or offensive on each front, each turn. We just talked about how the offensive option works, but sometimes you'll do an attrition option if you don't want to pay for an offensive. And the way this works is that you just count, you do normal movement, you can do sea transport, ground units can move, air units can rebase, naval can rebase. But you don't announce a bunch of ground attacks. Instead, you just count the number of factors that you have in contact with the enemy on that front. So in this case, I have 4, 4, and 3 gives me 11. Doesn't matter what their German factors are. And then I look down at this table in the lower right. I'm on the 11s column. I roll a die. There's some buttons around the table to just send a die result to chat. So I roll a 6. I look down the chart. I get nil results, so nothing happens in my attrition. But the results that can happen, C means the opponent has to remove a counter. It can be any ground unit on the front, so maybe remove this infantry. H is hex. I get to choose a hex that the opponent has to retreat from. You can't choose capitals, objective cities, fortresses, or beachheads for the opponent to retreat from during an attrition option. So attrition is just a cheap way, especially if you have a lot of forces, to force some casualties on the enemy. You want to take an offensive if you have air superiority, if you have significant ground superiority, or if you need to capture specific points this turn. So that's the attrition option. The last option I mentioned was pass. You'll generally only take a pass option if one of your allies has taken an offensive, but you don't want to. So if Britain declares an offensive in the West, each country declares offensives independently. If Britain declares an offensive in the West, France can't choose attrition. France has to either offensive or pass. If the offensive, they have to pay for it. If they don't want to pay for it, they have to pass. When you pass...
That's true of any 2 countries on the same side.
Yep. So potentially if USSR is fighting in Romania, which happens to be in the Med, anytime they want to call an offensive, England and France operating in the Med will have to either take an offensive or pass. Pass option, you'll get to move like normal, but there's some limitations. Your units cannot move adjacent to enemy units, and they can't move if they're adjacent to enemy units. So this French unit doing a pass option on the Western Front would not be able to move away. Similarly, if you started in Paris, you would not be able to move into Sedan adjacent to the unit. Your ships can only move if there's no enemy ships on the front that could intercept them. So that's the pass option and attrition. Supply is a very important concept in this game. So all of your ground units have to be in supply in order to operate normally. And they're in supply if they can trace a supply line from a supply source to their hex. A supply source is any capital, even a captured capital like Brussels will work. There are also some special supply sources like fortresses, which will supply only the units that start on them. Also, some Mediterranean ports are supply sources. Also, the whole eastern edge of the board is a supply source for Russia. And a supply line is just a continuous series of hexes. We don't have to actually draw them. You just have to be able to draw it if the opponent wants to confirm that you actually have it. Continuous series of hexes reaching out to your unit's hex. Like I said, enemy armor blocks supply routes, so this supply line would be invalid because both of these armor exert zone of control over this hex. Supply sources can supply any number of units. Even Brussels could, in theory, support the entire German war machine. It's a little weird, but we won't worry about it. If you need to supply troops overseas, it gets more complicated. So let's say the Germans have a foothold in England here. Move these guys back. London, Germany, in England rather. So I'm going to take some of these other guys off. Alright, so let's say the foothold's down here in Great Yarmouth. To provide supplies overseas, you have to draw a supply line from a supply source through a port that contains a ship that is providing supply. So I mentioned that's one of the missions they can run. It can't be intercepted. This 9 fleet could supply units with supplies coming from Berlin out of Wilhelmshaven out to another port. So provide supplies from a source to a port with a ship that's providing supply to the destination. One fleet can supply multiple locations. So this fleet could supply both Scapa Flow and Great Yarmouth here. And the fleet can escort supplies for a number of units equal to its naval factors. So this could supply up to 9 units. If you need to transfer supplies across fronts, like let's say England wants to provide supplies to forces that are invading Italy, they need a fleet that's going to take supplies from London out of Portsmouth, and those supplies go down to Gibraltar. And then another fleet has to carry supplies from Gibraltar to the beachhead in Italy. We didn't talk about this, but anytime you conduct an amphibious invasion, you can drop one of these bridgehead counters. Bridgeheads increase your stacking limit up to 5, but still only 2 units can attack out of a bridgehead. It increases your stacking limit up to 5, and also you can ship supplies into a bridgehead just as if it were a port. So that's how you provide supply. You really don't want to be out of supply because let's say this German fleet was destroyed. The Germans can't supply these 2 units. They will be out of supply. We have tokens down here for that. And if you start your turn out of supply, you can't move. If you end your turn out of supply, you are removed and cannot be rebuilt that turn. If paratroopers that don't have a normal supply route, if they're just relying on the supplies they get from jumping, if they're eliminated while they're out of supply, they're removed from the game permanently. Normally, units can be rebuilt. So it's very useful to attempt to cut off the opponent's supply, to encircle their units, to capture capitals so that they can't draw supplies from them, because you can slow their armies down and even eliminate whole armies For the Germans on the Eastern Front, it is entirely practical to isolate and destroy a full half of the Russian force pool in one turn in this way. So I mentioned the units can be rebuilt. So the way that happens is that every major power is going to have a supply of BRPs, basic resource points. We have a spreadsheet that lists where you start and tracks all of your expenditures. And basically you're going to have some allotment you can spend every turn. Costs for different units are listed down here. And you'll be able to construct units that either haven't been built yet, that are still in what's called your force pool, or units that have been returned to your force pool because they've been eliminated. You will get to place them during what's called the construction phase in any controlled territory in your home country, as long as there's no armor adjacent to them. So we've basically gone over the whole turn structure. You rebase navies, rebase air, move ground units, counter air, ground combat, construction, and then the last step is strategic redeployment. So in strategic redeployment, you designate some number of units. The number varies country to country. It's usually around 7. You designate some number of units and you move them any distance. It could be across the entirety of Europe if you wanted to, as long as they're moving over controlled friendly territory and they don't pass adjacent to enemy units. So if Germany controlled Belgium, nonetheless, they could not SR this 1-3 infantry into this hex because it would end up adjacent to the infantry. You can also SR air. They can move up to 8 hexes at a time, any number of times. They could again move across the whole map as long as they're jumping from base to base. Naval units can move from one port to another, and they can even transport fronts. They can move any distance to get to their new port, with limitations being that you can't pass through Gibraltar unless, well, the Straits of Gibraltar unless you control Gibraltar, and you can't pass through the Isthmus here unless you control Istanbul. There's no similar limitation for Copenhagen and the Straits of Denmark here. Right, so then after strategic redeployment, the turn transfers over to the opponent. That's the, I think that's all the basic rules. Is there anything that I'm missing, Max?
I don't think so. Maybe a faction description or just a general summation of the different scenarios that are available.
Yeah, that's good. So let me load up the starting layout again, and I can explain some kind of high-level strategy. Right. So I'll take the nations in the order that they set up, actually, for easy use here. So at the beginning of the game, we usually play the 1939 scenario or the campaign game, which also starts in 1939. And in 1939, the situation is that Germany has declared war on Poland, and the Détente, the Entente, Britain and France have declared war on Germany. No other nations are at war right now. So at the start of the game, the British player will set up Polish infantry here, maybe something like so. I'll just cover the high-level kind of strategic goals for countries without getting into tactics here. But this might be a typical Polish setup. They're just surrounding the capital to try and hold out if they can. Really, they can't hold out. Germany is going to take them turn 1. It's just a matter of how much damage they inflict. So we set up Poland first. There's this dotted line, Nazi-Soviet partition line. Germany and Russia are currently allied, and Germany has agreed not to cross this line. Russia cannot cross the line. They can't declare war on Germany. But if Germany crosses this line, then Russia will be free to declare war on them. The next to set up is Italy. So Italy's going to have a sizable navy, although they're not very good. They have the -1 DRM in the Med, -2 in the Atlantic. They're going to have some colonial forces in Albania, in Libya, and they're not going to be at war with anybody. So the Italian player, I really love playing Italy because they have a small force pool. They're not very good, but they have a lot of opportunity to grow. But it's like everything is a big risk because their forces are just so small. So Italy could declare war on Yugoslavia. Um, I didn't talk about declarations of war, but suffice to say for now, it costs you a good bit to declare war on a minor power, and anybody can declare war on any minor power, and it costs a lot to declare war on a major power. But they could declare war on Yugoslavia and try to take that over. This 20 BRPs that Yugoslavia provides every turn once conquered is a large portion of Italy's base of 75. Um, they could set up to try and take on England early. If England loses Alexandria and Suez, there's a major economic cost to them. But Italy has to be very careful of amphibious operations from either France or England early game. They have many beaches in Syracuse, Sardinia, of course the mainland, and very limited forces to defend themselves. Italy also has a special rule that once they are at war, they can loan units to Germany. They can loan up to 10 units. Loaning a unit costs you 1 SR, and then Germany controls them for all intents and purposes. So then all the allies start setting up. We'll start with Russia. So Russia starts with, this looks like a lot of units, but it's actually a very weak force pool. You can see all these infantry are 1-3s, they get very limited units, and then the rest of their force pool over here is very limited. Russia has a weak economy, very limited force pool at first, and Russia's game early on is to be prepared for anything but do nothing. So basically, Russia has the opportunity to declare war on Eastern Europe, which I mentioned is a colony. So Eastern Europe is the Baltic states, the eastern part of Poland, and this region of Romania called Bessarabia. They can declare war turn 1. All they have to do is take an attrition option and walk onto these cities because these are all colonies, they have no forces. If they capture all of them, it's worth 25 points. And then you basically just sit tight and prepare yourself for a German sneak attack. Russia can invade adjacent countries, Finland, Romania, and Turkey, with the exception that Germany has the option to garrison Finland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria by moving ground units into them. This is a unique ability to Germany. You usually cannot move ground units into a minor power unless you declare war on them. But if one of these, what's called minor axis allies, is garrisoned, then Russia can't declare war on them. So if Germany starts the game by deploying a garrison in Finland, Russia can't declare war on Finland. But if they neglect to, then Russia can. Late game, Russia is going to be invaded somewhere in 1941, early 42, and they're going to be very hard pressed by the Germans, although they have a lot of time to trade time for space here. And there's rules for the Allies providing lend-lease, shipping stuff through Murmansk. So their game is to just hold on for a long time, and then late game they become very strong economically and can roll the Germans back. France has a pretty limited force pool. They have some more armor they can build. This is all over air. It's pretty limited. And of course, they're just going to try to hold out as long as they can against the Germans. If you make it past fall of 1940, that's really pretty good. You have the Maginot Line down here. Sometimes you'll declare war on Luxembourg just to move up to the river, which is a good defensive point. You could defend the coastline, but mostly you're relying on the British to prevent a German amphibious invasion. You also, as France, have some colonies, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, as well as Lebanon, Syria. And you have some starting forces there. You could launch some attacks against Italy, but really you're going to need virtually every Frenchman defending against the Germans. And you'll still lose, it's just the way it is. And then England. So England's game early on is going to be to support France, send an expeditionary force over there, and to make sure Italy doesn't get out of control. So you have some pretty good forces to start in Egypt. You also have some strategic points. Malta, which has special rules that let you limit the number of Axis units that can be supplied in Africa. You also have Gibraltar over here that controls access to the Med and is a fortress. And the things to watch for early on are the Germans setting up an amphibious invasion somewhere sneaky like Scapa Flow. but also just help prop up France as much as possible. In the mid-war, you can consider a full press on Italy. There's special rules that lets Italy surrender early if the English lock down all of the Med. There's also special rules for activating Turkey if you really, really lock down the Med. You can also just help the Americans gear up for D-Day. Then the Americans don't set up initially, but I'll discuss them at this point. They don't enter the war till 1942. And when they do, the only way they can show up normally is by strategically redeploying to England. And then later they have to do D-Day or something else. They can move ships over to facilitate that, and they have a large, large force pool to build an extremely strong economy. The game for America is that you're basically not limited by the economy, you're limited by strategic redeployments and logistics. So obviously you're looking for D-Day to happen to liberate Paris. You could consider an Operation Torch, either through Casablanca or go into Gibraltar and then amphibiously invade any of these beachhexes. And you're also supplying Russia through Lend-Lease. And last, Germany. Germany sets up last because no one knows what they're going to do, and they have to be prepared for anything, but then Germany gets to choose what they actually do. You do have to set up some number of units to attack Poland, and you do have to launch at least one attack on Poland. But other than that, you could set up for a turn one attack on France. You could have Italy declare war, and then you could sneakily send your forces around the Alps to attack the south. You could consider attacking Yugoslavia or even some of these allies. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland have a chance to join you later on, and they have their own nice little force pools down here. But you could attack them early and take their BRPs if you really want to. But early game, what you want to do is take out Poland turn one. You'll be obliged to keep some units in Eastern Europe, and then you want to pivot to take down France as fast as possible. You can go the historic route and take out the lowlands and come through the north. You could push through the Maginot or Luxembourg. You could also pick up Denmark very easily. It's another 10 BRPs. Picking up Norway, you could do an amphibious invasion or send paratroopers in. And Norway has particular importance because this is how you defend against the Murmansk convoy. You can station air and naval units in Bergen, and then they can intercept Allied Lend-Lease going to Russia. So yeah, you take out Poland, you take out France as soon as possible, and then you've got to get two countries down in order to win. So you're either going for Sea Lion in London, or much more easily, you're going to try and take out USSR. Yeah, I think it's a good high level for all these countries. Any other thoughts, Max?
That covers it. That was great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we stop there?
All right.
See this.